Ghailckagh and good night. Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks so much for organizing this beautiful weather. Who ever thought on an island here that in this part of the world that we get such beautiful weather. Anyway, the title of my talk is it's quite long and complicated, but don't worry, the title is long and complicated compared to the rest of the lecture. It's not all this complicated. So the effective landscape of intergenerational language transmission, a case study of a Scottish Gaelic family. So this is based on research that I've been doing in this area that's really come up in sociolinguistics, looking at family language policy. And basically what family language policy is that it takes the ideas of language policy at the wider level, you know, language policy at the national level, the community level, and applies it to the family. So what we're really looking at here is sort of the triangular relationship here between the way that parents, caregivers, so parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, babysitters talk to children, and the way the children talk back, and sort of the relationship that both of these have with the wider community. And in family language policy research, and my book that just came out earlier this year on family language policy, I sort of distilled things down into three overarching contexts of different ways that different researchers have approached family language policy. Now, the field goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, and this researcher called Ranjat did a nice diary study of looking at his son's French-German development. And then we have another study done by Leopold, and that looked at his daughter's German-English development. Then we had a relatively large gap in the field, and it wasn't really until the 80s, 90s that people started showing a renewed interest in looking at child bilingualism. And from that, the field really took off. And a lot of these, I have these sort of three main contexts. So this one is the most common one that people have looked at is the one parent, one language context. And that basically does what it says on the tin. One parent speaks one language to the child, and then the other parent speaks the other language that they speak. And normally both parents are using their native languages. Similarly here, we have immigrant community, which are sort of differentiated from the Opal family context, because normally both parents are immigrants from the same place, and they're part of a large group of immigrants, and so normally both parents speak whatever minority language it is to the child. Then we have autochthonous minority community. I know that sounds long and complicated. Basically, it's just saying indigenous minority or endangered minority language communities. And that looks at, in the Celtic languages, we have here Herfrinn's study of Irish-speaking families in the Gaeltacht, and then Tim Armstrong's study on Scottish Gaelic as well. And especially with Tim's, and what I'll be bringing out in the presentation is that sometimes, in comparison usually to these other two contexts, parents aren't necessarily speaking their native language or the language they're most comfortable speaking to their child all the time. So that's that sort of background section done. And one of the things that's, oh dear. All right, there it changed. So one of the things that's really come out of this is this idea of child agency. So a lot of times when we think about intergenerational language transmission, we think of it as the parent talking to the child. But actually, the child has a lot to do with this as well. There, we got the other arrow. I know, a lot of drama for nothing. And A researcher at the University of Edinburgh, Joseph Gaffaranga, has looked at how the powerful role that the children can play in shaping this family language policy. And his work has shown that a lot of times, and this might sound familiar to some of the parents in the audience or some of the grandparents, caregivers, is that the caregiver will start out in the minority language, and then the child will speak the majority language, and from there on, it goes on in the majority language. And that's what he refers to as talking language shift into being. So we'll just keep that in the back of our heads, and we'll come back to that point then later. All right, so with my long and complicated title here, with this idea of the affective landscape, basically what I mean here is the emotions and the role that emotions play in how children understand and experience language. So here I have this sort of emotional landscape, if you will. The main question is how are language experiences mediated by emotional experiences? And so in terms of language planning, I'm sure that some of you may have come across the work of Professor Joshua Fishman, who's the most famous researcher in language policy and planning. And what he's said here is that he has this very famous 8 stages going from a not very healthy language all the way to a quite healthy language. And he's emphasized a lot in his work that intergenerational transmission, so the use of the language in the home, is really the fulcrum. So if you don't get this stage, you won't get the other stages. Now this has been debated a lot in language policy research, but hopefully what I'll show here is sort of the connections between the different levels. Yeah, so my research is based on 3 generations of a Gaelic-speaking family on the Isle of Skye, which is here. And I have given them the pseudonym, the Campbell family. And I first came into contact with this family in 2007 when I wrote a letter to the editor to a Gaelic-speaking newspaper. And I said, can I come research you? And hello, Gaelic-speaking families, is there anyone who wants to be researched? And this woman named Nana wrote back to me and she said, oh yes, I have 3 generations of a Gaelic-speaking family. Come and stay with us as long as you like. Now, she didn't know that I would literally take her up on this because then for the next 9 years, I researched this one family. So be careful what you say. So what I'm going to be talking about today is mostly Nana and speaking to her granddaughter, Maggie. And the way that I've gone about this project is basically I've just sort of recorded them when I stay with them. So usually for 2-week periods or a few days, and we just sort of do normal things. So I've included some pictures of the very beautiful Isle of Skye here. And there are 2 main corpora, one in 2009, which was for my PhD thesis, and then one for 2014. So one thing to really emphasize about the family is that they are trying really hard to maintain Gaelic with the youngest members of the family. But this is quite an uphill struggle. As you can see, each generation speaks less Gaelic than the generation before, and over time, speakers appear to be speaking less Gaelic. And there are a lot of varied reasons for this. But one of them, besides sort of what happens at the everyday level of conversation, is going back to this idea of emotions. One of the things I've looked at is how certain practices and structures in the family really make the child associate Gaelic with authority. And I argue that ultimately, associating the minority language with authority is not really a good way to get the child to speak the language. And one of the ways that this happens is that at the time, this is a transcript from the 2009 recordings, and at this point Maggie was 3 years old, and her dad doesn't really do this much now, but at the time he and some of the other family members, they wouldn't really use much Gaelic with her, but they would use it to discipline her. And this sort of switch here, so you can see here in this typical parent-child conversation, I think here, don't do that, it's not funny, yes it is, no it's not, back and forth. And then finally here we have highlighted, he says, I'm looking at you because I'm speaking to you, be mogul, so behave yourself. And so he tends to use this at this particular time. He doesn't anymore, he actually uses a lot more Gaelic with the children now, but just at this particular moment of time, it seemed to be the favored way of interacting with the children was to use Gaelic as this sort of last resort strategy. I put this grandma picture up here as well, is because another way that I think that the children began to associate Gaelic with authority was that the people who were most likely to speak Gaelic in this family, the grannies, they were also the ones in sort of the higher positions in the family. Like, the older authoritative people were the ones most likely to speak Gaelic. And this is then replicated in the wider community here. Here I have a picture of some old people, I think, playing dominoes, I'm not quite sure. But what happens is that then this is replicated on a wider level. So the people who are most likely to speak Gaelic are the older speakers. Now this finding was reported on very nicely in a study done of the language Casca, which is spoken in Canada. And the researcher Barbara Meek found that because Casca was mainly only spoken by older people in the community, that the children either thought that you didn't speak Casca until you became a grandparent, or that you were supposed to use Casca when you were yelling at people. So that's how they thought of it. And I think that Maggie might have some similar associations. I think also the fact that Gaelic is not used in the wider community very often. Now Skye, as of the last census, only 29.4% of the population spoke Gaelic. So you don't hear much Gaelic in the community, sadly, anymore. But you do hear it in the school. She goes to a Gaelic immersion school, but unlike your lovely Bun school here just across the street, it's not a freestanding school. So it is part of a larger English school. But I think the fact that, that it's spoken in school and not the wider community means that she has this sort of authoritative association. You can see that here. I have a little excerpt from a conversation here. Her great aunt is asking her, so when the teacher speaks to you in Gaelic in school, do you answer in English? No. Okay, and then the aunt switches. She says, "No rinas kuchikin and Gaelic and a ho, kursuna freckers and birla." And Maggie says, "Because I'm not in school." So this association with, okay, I'm in school, I use Gaelic, that's that, and then I don't need to speak Gaelic all the time. So you can see how this authoritative association is being built up. But now I'd like to change gears completely, and I focused a lot on how these affective dimensions sort of perpetuate the language shift in the family. But now I'd like to focus on something much more positive, which is how having a positive emotional relationship with the language can ultimately, I think, bring about language maintenance. And this is something that I've recently submitted to the International Journal of Multilingualism. And in writing up this article, two studies really were important in how I started thinking about all of this. So the first one is a study done about a Bangla grandmother and her grandchild in London. And the study showed that the grandmother and they had this task of putting together a puzzle. And the researcher looks at how the grandmother very successfully uses this task as a springboard to teach the granddaughter more about the language and the culture in a very sort of unobtrusive, not very didactic way, but in a way that's very conducive to language maintenance. Another study is done the same year, actually, by a researcher called Chevalier, and she looked at two children growing up trilingually in Switzerland. And what she found was that one of the children had an American aunt, and the child would see this American aunt about once a week or so. And even though the child didn't really have much English input in her community, or that actually she developed English pretty quickly because the aunt had this very vivacious, very interactive style with the child. She would ask her a lot of questions. She would make sure that the child was involved with things. And Chevalier posited that that really helped explain why the child spoke such good English, despite the fact that she didn't have much English input. So now I'd like to turn to my own data, and I want to look at two excerpts of a conversation that come from when Maggie was 3 years old and 4 months. And this is Maggie interacting with her Nana. And I think this is a really adorable little excerpt. I think most things that Maggie does are adorable at this age, three years old. But here, Nana, Maggie and I are in the kitchen, and Nana looks and the car's going away, and she says, all right, that's the B&Bs. So B&Bs is what people refer to as, that means they're bed and breakfast guests. One thing I want to point out, well, there's quite a number of things here, but one thing that I think is important is here we have this particular event. So they're watching the car go by of the bed and breakfast guests, and Nana says, you know, who's that? Oh, that's the B&Bs. And immediately she turns the interaction away from her wondering who the people are to speaking to Maggie. And she focuses it all on Maggie's experience of the bed and breakfast guests. So she says, oh, nice, the little girl, the girl that was staying. And then she continues, was Dave, who's Maggie's brother, was he speaking to her? And it goes on like this. And then we have the very cute, and Nana and I actually still laugh about this one. That's my B&Bs. They're not your B&Bs because they were staying at Maggie's house, not Nana's house. So therefore they were Maggie's B&Bs. And it goes on, and she has this really high interactional style with Maggie, that she, you know, everything is pointed towards Maggie. So they made a ball. And you can see that what she's doing in linguistic terms is she recast what Maggie says in English and she puts it in Gaelic. So you can see here in turn 20 that she says, you know, Maggie says they made a ball for me, and Nana says, okay, they made a ball, and she repeats it then in Gaelic. You also get this very sort of high interactional style when she says, not my B&Bs, I know. You, they're your B&Bs. And so she starts in English, but then she goes on and says, you, using the emphatic form in Gaelic, B&Bs, akatsa, your B&Bs, and then it goes on to intalat B&Bs. Do you like bed and breakfast guest? One thing that you can notice here is that Nana is using a lot of questions. And in the interaction overall, this interaction is about 12 minutes. And throughout it, she uses 30 questions. And normally the questions aren't really sort of focused towards something that, depending on Nana's answer, or Maggie's answer would require immediate action. So in the next one, you'll see that she asks Maggie, you know, have you had your breakfast? And that would determine whether or not Nana's meant to make breakfast for Maggie. But really, the point of the questions is to really get talk out of Maggie. And I think that the questions serve a very important function, not only in making this a very sort of playful, close, child-centered interaction, but they also, linguistically, they give Maggie an opportunity to use Gaelic. And like the rest of the Celtic languages, there are, of course, no words for yes or no in Gaelic. So Nana is giving her the opportunity to use quite a lot of Gaelic to develop linguistically, should Maggie wish. Now, Maggie does not use much Gaelic here. You see the one thing that she does use is clachan, stones. What does that have to do with singing? Well, what Maggie was doing at this point was that she had these stones and she would pretend that they were her organ and she would sing a song. But I should point out she did have other toys. I don't want everyone to go away thinking that children in Skye only have stones to play with. So this was what was going on. So you can see here that Nana makes it a very child-centered interaction, but at the same time, she lets Maggie sort of take the lead. That is, she lets Maggie have autonomy. So once it's clear that Maggie's getting a bit tired of answering these questions about the B&B guest, that Nana just sort of says, okay, you go sing, and it goes on from there. So she has, on one hand, she lets Maggie shape the interaction, but on the other hand, she balances this with a very high involvement. And now there's a bit of a catch-22 here. What you've seen with the previous slide is Nana speaks Gaelic and Maggie speaks English. And this goes on and on like this. And in sort of linguistic terms, there's a very famous study on a child's Norwegian English development by a researcher named Elizabeth Lanza. And she writes that actually this sort of strategy, which is the move on strategy, if you click it, it has a circle. Again, a lot of drama for nothing. Sorry about that. That what Nana is using is the move on strategy. And Elizabeth Lanza writes that actually, in order to produce a bilingual child, normally it's better to negotiate a monolingual context. So that would be something like the parent pretending if the child uses the majority language, if the parent pretends, oh, I didn't understand that, or I don't speak that language, that is more conducive, or repeat it using the other language, or say, can you say that again in Gaelic? But Nana just sort of moves on, and I think she does this for a number of reasons within the family, that she can't really say, no, you speak Gaelic. But I think that it's also important to point out, and this goes back to this sort of double-edged sword nature of language planning, is that what she's having to do is say, okay, yes, it would be great if Maggie spoke Gaelic all the time. That's not going to happen. Instead of going, you speak Gaelic, you speak Gaelic, you speak Gaelic, and making it a very sort of didactic, sort of teacher-child-student dynamic, or sort of imposing this on, feeling like she's imposing this on Maggie. She lets Maggie take the lead, and she sort of just adapts to it. So even though it's not, linguistically, is maybe not as conducive to producing a Gaelic-speaking child, that actually interactionally, what she's doing is she's making a space where she's using Gaelic in a very positive, emotional way. And if she was pulling up Maggie for language choice all the time, then she wouldn't get this same sort of positive resonance. So a bit of a catch-22 there. Yeah. this is, Maggie has brought Nana some flowers and some little daisies. And okay, so these are the flowers with their faces and their legs, as you can see from the transcript. So what's happened here is Nana is putting the flowers in some water, and she says, sort of to herself, you know, I should make potpourri out of this, because the flowers that she has don't actually have legs, don't have stems. She says stems, but later on then Maggie picks this up, and the word Cassin, stem or leg, I think Nana says stems here, but Maggie picks it up as meaning legs, like your legs here. And she says they just got a face, and then again you can see here that Nana is recasting. So she's saying what Maggie has said in English, but she's saying it in Gaelic and says, okay, that's the word. And then Maggie goes on with this and says, and two legs, but and then Nana repeats it, and then we have her sort of recasting it again. So one leg on them, isn't it? And then she says yes, and she goes, this is the face, and then the one leg, and then she turns it again. What we can see is she's taking something relatively simple, but she's making it all about Maggie and Maggie's experience, and making this very quite cute and playful way of describing the parts of the flowers. And she says, you have a face and two legs. And then you get this really adorable code mix where Maggie says one cas, two cas. And then Nana recasts that, all in Gaelic, saying un chas, da chas, un chas er fleur. Now, what she's doing here is you don't see as many questions here. You do see, you know, these requests for confirmation. But in describing something quite small, she's actually doing quite a lot linguistically. You just don't know it. So here she's emphasizing the lenition on the word cas. So cas, you know, you've got a nice, that sound in there that you get in Gaelic with the numbers 1 and 2. When the noun follows it, you also get a dative construction. You also get a genitive construction. You get a lot of really rich linguistic input, but it's quite seamless the way that Nana does this. So she's making this really a positive emotional experience through this activity, but she's also sort of subtly pushing in all these important ways to learn language. So here, I think that she's helping Maggie to build positive associations with the minority language, and she's really embedding teaching within this. But then there's also this sort of double-edged sword. Well, to make it positive, a positive emotional experience, she can't say, Maggie, now you speak Gaelic all the time. So there's sort of a fine balancing act going on through this. Now, Nana is a native speaker, and she was raised in Gaelic. She was socialized through Gaelic, and she's very good and she's very adept at this. But minority languages, as we know, and as in the case with other Gaelic-speaking families, as my friend Tim Armstrong's research has found, is that not all the time will you get native-speaking parents speaking the language to their children. You will get parents who will have learned the language, or maybe learning along with their children. So they send their children to Gaelic medium school and they want to use more Gaelic in the house. And one of the challenges is getting Gaelic to feel natural. So Tim has this really nice quote from one of the parents. So I suppose that my attitude is that Gaelic is just a normal, natural part of our lives. That's the way I want it to be. I don't want it to feel like an extra special, super duper project, even though it is in a way, but I want it to feel, yes, natural. And so this idea of, well, how do you make it feel natural? And a researcher who has worked a lot on language as emotions has written about how for some parents it might be quite hard to use the language that they weren't socialized in as children with their own children. So she has an example from one of her interviewees saying, I have a preference for French. When my children were born, I wanted to use just English so that they would be accustomed, but I couldn't. It sounded untrue. And this idea of something not sounding true. So then a Welsh respondent said, Welsh is the language which is the one that feels natural for expressing feelings. Expressing endearment in English has a false acting ring to it. So this idea that sometimes using a language that's not your native language can be hard. But I've done another thing where I've made a very complicated title just to say something very simple. But what I want to point out to you here is that it's actually not impossible, even if you don't have much of the language, to get this really positive, affective, emotional bond. So here, this is drawn from the B&B's extract. And here Nana is, this is the part where Maggie has just said, they're my B&Bs, they're not your B&Bs, Nana. And so Nana repeats it, and then she says, I know. But the bits that really make it really child-centered, the bits that really build this bond are quite simple. She's saying usa, usa, so you, the emphatic form, not hard. You'll probably learn that on your first lesson in a Gaelic or maybe a Manx class, and then B&B's akatsa, your B&Bs, and then a very simple question, and talat B&Bs. Do you like B&Bs? Again, a very easy question that you probably will have learned in your first classes. So you can, the point is to show you that actually the things that make it effective aren't necessarily the things aren't necessarily that complicated. Of course, as I've showed you, Nana is very skilled, but even if you can't, throw in all these genitives and datives, as we saw Nana do in the other clip, you can do effective things as a caregiver. And so the point that I'm going to end on here is this idea of the importance of child-centered activities for language maintenance. And a lot of my thinking about this comes by a study that was done in Australia of parents where one of the parents spoke German. So in some of the families, the mother spoke German, and in some of them, the father spoke German. And these families tended to follow the traditional caregiver roles. So the fathers worked and the mothers stayed home with the children. And other research has said, well, children with mothers who speak the minority language are likely to do better at speaking it because they have more overall input. So they spend more time with the minority caregiver than children with minority speaking fathers. But in Dobka's study, this wasn't necessarily true, that actually a lot of the children with the German speaking fathers did quite well. And what she posited is that the children with the German-speaking fathers had real quality time in German. So their dads would come home, and it was all of a sudden this special thing, and the dads would play with them, read them a story, or doing something that was very child-centered. Whereas the mothers sort of had the whole gamut of, put your shoes on, eat your breakfast, brush your teeth, out the door. And that wasn't really the case with the fathers. So I think, now I'm not a parent, so I always feel a bit weird saying what to do as a parent or a grandparent or any other sort of caregiver with children. But I think my own research and other research has suggested that, okay, if you speak the minority language to your child all the time for a range of things, then that's fine. But I think what happens, and what we saw with Maggie's father, is a lot of times what happens is that parents might think, okay, I'm speaking to my child now, what can I say in this language? Okay, I can say brush your teeth, and that comes out in the minority language. But rather than focusing on sort of the mundane task of speaking to a child in a language such as Manx or Gaelic, instead of feeling the pressure of, I can't say all these things, I can't have the range of conversation, is to focus on something that is really positive for the child. So focus on saying, okay, we'll have every week or every day we'll do a special playtime activity and we'll use the minority language. And then that sort of builds this positive emotional resonance. And so then when the child grows up, he or she might or might not use the language, but the language will be embedded in something quite positive, and I think that that's more likely to produce a child who speaks Manx or Gaelic than a child who thinks, okay, I can say brush your teeth and go up to bed in the minority language. But having that and having that important emotional aspect for the minority language. So these are just two sites. I just started work at the University of Limerick comparing Gaelic-speaking families in the Western Isles to Irish-speaking families in the Gaeltacht, and they both have support groups, Tusma and then Gaelic for Parents, that give a lot of ideas on how you can sort of go about this, how you can incorporate the minority language into quite fun activities. And so just some formal acknowledgements. I have to thank the COST New Speaker Network. This research has benefited from discussions within the COST Action, New Speakers in Multilingual Europe, Opportunities and Challenges. And I also, previous work, received some financial support from SOLSHA, the Interuniversity Gaelic Language Research Network. But most importantly, if you can switch the slide, thank you all for listening to this. Time for Gurab Managat and Guramaya. So thanks so much for listening to this.